Good evening, everybody. My name is Todd Scholl. I am the lead learner at the South Carolina Education Association's Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. You can learn more about us at cool.us. That's cewl.us, cewl.us. In case you haven't heard the exciting news that we released yesterday, which is that the SCEA is endorsing Lisa Ellis for State Superintendent of Education. I've got my shirt, got our little graphic here, and we're so excited to be endorsing an educator for this position. We really need someone who knows what educators are going through, what it's like to work in a school, someone who has education experience, education. We need somebody in this position who really can help us help our state recruit and retain the best teachers, because if we have the best teachers, then we can have the best education system for our students. And that's ultimately what this is about. If you want to learn more about her campaign, you can go to lisaforsc.com. That's lisaforsc.com. She has shirts for sale, all kinds of stuff. You can learn more about her platform, about events that she has coming up, and ways that you can support her campaign. We wish her the best, and hope that all educators and public education supporters will come together to support her campaign. But tonight, we have just a really special guest, someone that I've known now for, I think it's been about 6 years. I met her about 6 years ago at a retreat that we did. Her name's Kara Lee. She received her master's in early childhood education from Converse College. She's currently enrolled in graduate school at Clemson University. A former public school educator with over a decade of experience in the classroom, Kara has served as program coordinator for USC Upstate's Child Protection Training Center, providing extensive training in trauma-informed practices, as well as supervised upstate education majors in clinical placements and mentored first-year teachers in her home county of Greenville, South Carolina. Some of you may have been to one of her trainings. I went. It was just unbelievable. She's a graduate of the year-long certification program offered through Mindful Schools. She's a certified ACE master trainer. She has had the privilege of speaking to professionals from across the country and looks forward to the day that heart smarts are as treasured as brain smarts. And I couldn't agree more. She also was a co-facilitator at our retreat, at the SCEA's retreat that we held at the end of June. And a good friend, a colleague. Everybody, welcome Kara Lee. How are you doing tonight, Kara?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, always thrilled when folks have an opportunity to learn from you. You do such a good job of taking what can be difficult and hard to understand concepts and putting it into terms, I think, that we can quickly understand. So I'm going to just turn it over to you and say thank you so much for your time tonight. And thank you so much for your willingness to always collaborate whenever I ask, and looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. All right. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see where it says becoming trauma informed. So if you'll give me a thumbs up on that, Todd, that's awesome.
Good.
So you guys may notice, does it show you that there are subtitles not available? Does it say that at the bottom for you?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know how to get rid of that, but we're just going to work with it because I've moved from a PC to a Mac. So we're just going to work with it. All right. So you may notice that becoming is in italics, and that is on purpose. It is because in 1 hour, I am not going to give you all the information that you can possibly need about trauma and how it can affect us and our students and our colleagues and our administrators and everybody around us. But my hope is that in the next 60 minutes, I'll give you some ideas of what trauma might look like, how you might mitigate some of the effects, what you can do about it. So we are becoming trauma informed. We are not leaving here as the experts in trauma informed practices. So Todd gave all of this great information. So I'm not going to reiterate any of it other than to say you can see that clearly education is a huge part of my life because there are a lot of colleges present on the screen. So ones that I have worked at, ones that I have studied at, those that I have studied and worked at. So I'm very excited. This year, I'll be able to supervise education majors once again through Clemson University, which I'm thrilled. So the first thing that I like to talk about when we go into becoming trauma-informed is just to touch briefly on adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. Some of you have maybe heard of this term before, or you have had more extensive training. It is a 2 to 3 hour training, right? So this is just a brief snapshot, but these two gentlemen on the screen, Dr. Robert Anda, who worked with the CDC in Atlanta with smoking cessation, and Vincent Felitti, who worked in California, Kaiser Permanente, with a weight loss clinic. They are the paramount researchers that really started this movement of looking at adversity that occurs in childhood and its potential long-term effects. And they basically determined that there are super strong correlations between the amount of adversity and the type of health problems, mental issues, and behavioral problems that we may experience later. Now, as I mentioned before, it's a 2 hour training at the very least. So this is just a super quick overview. So they determined that adverse childhood experiences were traumatic or stressful events. And those events lowered an individual's capacity to cope or adapt to future events. One of the things about the adverse childhood experiences study that I'm going to share with you on the next slide is it looked at very specific events happening in the home. Now, trauma is the result. So trauma is what happens in response to this adverse experience. It exceeds the ability for us to cope, and we become unable to sort of integrate the emotions that were involved in that experience. Pretty much everyone who is going to watch this webinar has had some sort of adversity in their lifetime. Not everyone has experienced trauma, however. So we can all have traumatic events occur, but we may not all be traumatized. And that is important because the trick really is in the response itself, right? We are overwhelmed with our capacities to be able to integrate the experience and to resolve what occurred. So a really good example of this is COVID. And we certainly saw over the past several years that we all experienced COVID collectively, right? Globally. But not everybody had the same response to COVID, and not everybody had the same access to resources. So if we were all in the same sea, we all had access to different kinds of boats, right? Some of us didn't even have a flotation device. Others of us had plenty of supports. Maybe we felt like we had a good boat to get us through those waters. So I want to always make that distinction. That comes into play when we talk about the 10 types of ACEs that were present and studied by Drs. Anda and Felitti. You can imagine if they were going to look at all of the adversity that a child could experience, there'd be no end to the inventory. But they looked at these specific areas: 3 types of abuse, 2 types of neglect, and 5 types of household dysfunction. When they gave this inventory, they basically said, by the age of 18, have you experienced these things? The scores for an ACE range from a 0 to a 10. And what they found is the more adversity someone experienced, the more health problems they seem to experience later in life. So as we look at this, I want you to ask yourself, what's missing? So as I mentioned earlier, you know, there's, this is very household specific, but it is not the only kinds of adversity that we could encounter as children or before the age of 18. So I am going to stop for just a moment and see, Todd, if there's any comments that are coming in on what kinds of things might be missing. And if not, that's okay.
Not yet. I'm
Okay.
monitoring. We do have a few, but I'll pop back in if I need to.
Perfect. So take that information and think, okay, so the ACEs study looked specifically at household dysfunction in many ways, right? What happened within the family. But the more research that has been done on ACEs, the wider the lens has become. And so we recognize oftentimes that household dysfunctions and adverse experiences can be rooted in adverse community experiences. And there are also environmental experiences, right? So that initial inventory of 10 things did not list a pandemic, but we've all collectively experienced that now. And we know that that has had an effect on our children before the age of 18 because it totally interfered with their school. So Bessel van der Kolk has done a lot of work surrounding trauma. And what he talks about is that trauma comes back as a reaction, not as a memory. If we have a traumatic response to an event, then it is stored inside of the body. It is triggered by an outside sensory experience, and we have a reaction that tends to be instantaneous and without logical thought. So oftentimes it's easy for people to understand this in relation to veterans that suffer from PTSD. If I have a veteran who has come back and has served in active duty, I recognize that the trauma that that person has experienced comes back as a reaction to, let's say, a car backfiring or the sound of fireworks. Their reaction to those things may be to duck and cover. It may be to become incredibly aggressive. It isn't about them having an understanding of what's happening in the present moment. That trigger occurs, the reaction follows. There isn't a connection between the safety that may actually be happening in the real world, because our brains don't discriminate between real and perceived threat. So when we talk about having a trauma-informed approach, the first step is to realize that trauma has a widespread impact. Over 60% of the US population has experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences as defined by that initial study done by Drs. Anda and Felitti. 14% had experienced 4 or more. We need to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, not just in our students, but also in the families that we work with, in the colleagues that we see in our hallways, and the administrators that may be the leaders of our school. We want to respond by integrating the information that we know about trauma and making sure that we have policies, procedures, and practices that are trauma-informed. And finally, we want to resist re-traumatization. So I'm going to try and touch a little bit on each of these things in this presentation, and I've already sort of talked a little bit about the widespread impact. So let's talk just a little bit about the brain and the stress response system. And I am not a neuroscientist, so this is pretty basic. So when Todd talked earlier about how I can make really complicated things easy, it's because I only go as deep as my knowledge. So the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. So the brainstem is the first part of our brain to develop, okay? And it takes care of all of our automatic functions, the heart rate, the blood pressure, the body temperature. These are not things that we are thinking about on a day-to-day issue, right? Those are automatic. So that brainstem is ready and raring to go the minute we are formed, conceived, and have our brains developing. The next part of the brain is the limbic system, which is deep inside. If I have like a hand model of the brain, the limbic system is deep inside, kind of behind my ear. And that's where the amygdala is housed. That's the fight, flight, or freeze alarm system, right? Also the hippocampus, which is really powerful and important when it comes to learning and memory. And if the brainstem is about regulation, the limbic system is really about relationships, right? So really salient, strongly felt, relational, emotional experiences come from that limbic system. Now, the last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. And that is the spot right behind our forehead. And that is the rational portion of the brain. So that's logical. It can take perspective. It can organize things. And the thing that's really interesting about the prefrontal cortex is it continues to develop through the age of like 25. Now researchers are saying it's our mid-20s that it continues to develop. Almost all of our academic material in school is based on that prefrontal cortex. The parts of the brain that get worked the most are the parts that are the first to respond. So if my brainstem, which is about my regulation, and my limbic system, which is about my relational attunement, are more developed, have had more experiences, they can overwhelm the logic and rationality of the prefrontal cortex, especially considering that that prefrontal cortex takes so long to develop. And we really have to be intentional about making the connections into that prefrontal cortex. So I'm going to talk a little bit about triggers, and I'm going to give an example. And this is a real life example. And Todd, I don't think you've heard this one before, but I think you'll be able to understand why this would be a trigger. So let's say that something happens and that sets off an alarm in that limbic system. So in this particular case, a friend of mine sent me a video one day from his phone. He had been driving down 385, which is an interstate, so likely going 70 miles an hour, maybe more. He looked over his passenger side window because something caught his eye out of the peripheral vision. And there is a 5-foot black snake on the inside of the passenger door, making its way across the dashboard. Okay, so every time I share this story, people are like, okay, I'm triggered, right? Yeah, exactly. So what happens is that alarm system goes off and all of these hormones are released into the body. And that alarm system says, okay, it is time to go into a fight, flight, or freeze. And so I'll ask people, like, what are you gonna do when this happens? So Todd, I'll ask you, you've just seen that black snake. What are you going to do?
I'm freaking out. Like,
right.
I'm probably going to, my first thing is just be startled and go, whoa. And then I'm going to try to probably pull over and get out of the car.
Right. So that's exactly what happens. Right. So here's the thing. If I were to be in the back seat of that car and start asking you your multiplication tables, would you be able to remember them?
Mm-mm.
No, because at this point, that prefrontal cortex is offline, right? My stress response system doesn't care about being rational. My stress response system cares about survival. So I always like to ask my participants, let's say you keep the car, because some people just say they're going to leave the car on the side of the road, which we've determined maybe that's why all those cars on the side of the road have those orange stickers. We're like, everybody has a snake in their car. Mm-hmm. So let's say you keep the car, right? You get the snake out. What happens the next time you get in the car?
You remember,
yeah, what are you going to do?
Check for the snake.
You're going to check for a snake.
Yeah.
Right? And how many times do you think you'll get into the car and check for snakes?
Like every time.
Every time, right? So this is a dramatic but possible, right, event that occurred one time. It occurred one time. And we can already see that it has set a reaction for us that we are going to get in and check for that snake every time we get in the car. So let's say I'm talking about a metaphor for a student's life, and it's not a snake, it's a caregiver with an alcohol problem who comes home, and that kid knows that every time they hear the door slam, it means that stepdad's been out drinking, right? They are going to adapt to that stress response, and they are going to look for ways to survive. We might check our car for snakes. That kid may hide. That kid may become aggressive. Whatever that child learns in that moment to help them. So it's going to look like maladaptive behavior somewhere else, but at home it makes sense, right? If I were to take the behavior of checking the car and the snake, for looking for snakes in the car, and I started to do that in every place that I went into, that might look a little strange. If every room I start to go into, I look for snakes, that's going to look really weird, and people may not understand. So it may not make sense if I have a student in my class who hears a door slam and they hide underneath their desk. That looks maladaptive. But remember, trauma comes back as a reaction, not as a memory. And the stress response system has taken over, and the brain, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, is no longer concerned about rational thinking. So taking that into this autonomic nervous system, again, super brief overview, because I'm not a nervous system specialist either, but taking all that information that I just talked about with the brain, and knowing that the brainstem connects to that autonomic nervous system. And I usually think about the ANS as connected with our breathing, right? So there's two parts to our autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic and there's the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is the part that works with that fight or flight that happens with the emotions. The parasympathetic works against the emotions. It's my rest and digest. So I see the snake in the car. What am I going to start to do? For me, probably going to hyperventilate, right? My breathing is going to become super shallow because I'm getting primed to react. Now, if for some reason I look over and it's not really a snake at all, I don't know what else it could be. It's inside of the car, but it's not a snake, right? I'm probably going to have a nice deep breath. Oh gosh, okay. And my parasympathetic nervous system is taken over. Now, on the smaller scale, all day long, right? We're sort of in this ebb and flow. Things arouse and then we settle. Arouse and then we settle. So that is a typical regulated nervous system. What happens with our traumatic events, snake example, is that we start to peak and dive. So I see the snake, I hyperventilate, I take a deep breath when I realize I'm safe. If I am consistently exposed to toxic stress, my autonomic nervous system may become dysregulated and get stuck. I may get stuck in an on position where I am constantly in fight or flight. So I am anxious, hyperactive, restless. If I'm talking to educators, how many of you know students like this in your classroom, right? Mm-hmm. The opposite is that I might get stuck in the off position where the parasympathetic takes over and I basically dissociate or I become depressed. And Todd actually was one of the presenters at a retreat that I was on, and that was the first place where I saw this information. And I remember looking at it and thinking, holy cow, that is a snapshot of my classroom. And over time, and the more I do this work, I've realized this is a snapshot of my culture. So many of us are constantly in a stress reaction mode. And we are either dissociated because we are just tapped out, or we are hypervigilant because we are constantly on the lookout for what's going to come next. And within the context of a pandemic, uncertainty is a container for anxiety. So we've collectively, many of us have been stuck in the on position for a long time. Another way to consider this information is through something that's called the window of tolerance. And I really love this idea. So the graph is basically like our autonomic nervous system, right, that we saw. And that window of tolerance is, I'm calm enough that I can learn, I can function, right? We can escalate or we can dissociate depending on what happens. But I like to give this sort of example to see, and Todd, you taught at one time, so you tell me if you've had this experience before. You wake up late to go into the school, okay? And there's a new traffic pattern. So there's a whole lot more people out there. And so you're really, really late. Ever had that experience?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And then you get to school and you had forgotten that you have duty, morning duty this week, and you don't have time to prep for your class. Yeah. And now it's the day before the field trip and you got that student, and that student still has not turned in their permission slip. And when they walk in that morning, you say, "Where's your permission slip?" And they say, "Don't got it." Where are you?
At the very least, escalated.
Yeah, right. There's been so much stress that has happened to you before you ever walked into the door that your window of tolerance has decreased. Because the window of tolerance is not fixed. It is reactionary based on what's happening in our life. Now, let's say you get up before your alarm goes off and you feel well rested, and you go through the drive-through at Starbucks and the person in front of you pays for your coffee, and you get to work and you don't have any duty. And same exact situation, kid still needs a permission slip. Are you nearly as frustrated? No, right? Collectively, our windows of tolerance have been, really narrow. And that has been for the students, and it's been for the teachers. And I have no doubt that many of us have found ourselves incredibly stressed by things that normally, right, would not have had that effect. And it is because the window of tolerance is not fixed. So I know that the things that happen before I walk into my classroom can affect my window of tolerance. And I also know the same thing about my students. The brain drives behavior. It looks like emotions. It is emotions. It's all a part of the brain. So I share this because I think it's a really important connection to make between what is happening with behavior in the classroom. And I don't know if we have anybody watching live, Todd. If we do, yes, I'd love to hear what they think about this particular graphic.
All right. So if you heard that, feel free to type in and I'll share that with Kara. There's a little bit of a delay between us talking and then,
okay.
Yeah. So if someone does come on, I'll make sure that I'll pop
awesome.
in.
I had a student who, this was first grade, and he was the oldest of 4, and he was 6. So there were 3 younger kids in the house that were not school age. And his mom was single and did not have any family supports. Do you think this child had difficulty concentrating in school?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think he was easily distracted?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it seemed like he didn't listen or he was disorganized?
Oh, sure.
What about hyperactive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. I considered myself a very proactive teacher. And prior to becoming more aware of trauma and its effects, my response to those behaviors would have been to go to my school psychologist and say, I need a behavior rating scale. This kid can't pay attention. They're not on grade level. They can't get anything done. They're aggressive and they have outbursts in class. Sometimes they seem to blow things out of proportion. It looks like ADHD. They may have even gone to a pediatrician and a pediatrician would have said it was ADHD, but it wasn't. It was a response to what was happening. Don't be so quick to assume. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you go and you ask kids, hey, tell me all the things about what's going on at home. But if you have a relationship with your students, they'll tell you. So just recognize there's a really strong overlap between some of the behaviors that we see. And I feel like this, I'm currently in a counseling degree program. I have a feeling that I might just print this out and put it in a frame and hang it on my wall. I think it's one of the most powerful quotes that I've seen to help me reframe behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is really powerful is not just who said it, but when they said it.
Wow.
And this quote should not be stunning to us as educators, especially if we've known it this long. So having this awareness, this framework changes the lens. Instead of saying, what is wrong with this kid? We can ask the question of what has happened to this kid. And again, real cautious on this one. We're not investigators, right? So it's not that we are going to get an answer to this question necessarily, but knowing about the prevalence of trauma, we know that we can start to look for the triggers. We can look for the types of behaviors that may result, and we can have better interventions, more skillful responses. So there's a lot on this page, and I'm just going to leave it up for a moment. These are a list of possible triggers for students in a school environment. And Todd, I'm going to let you look at that and you tell me if any of these stand out to you.
Well, it's interesting because there's some that, depending on your perspective, seem like, gosh, I can't believe that would, like, changes in routine would be a trigger. Mm-hmm. And then there's other ones that are so obvious, like witnessing violence. Mm-hmm. That would be like on the other end of that spectrum for a lot of people. Like, yeah, I can see where that's really traumatic, just to witness violence. Mm-hmm. That, or like being asked to, another one would be asked to discuss difficult topics. Some people like that wouldn't be a big deal, but being harassed or intimidated, you could see how that would be. So I think it sort of shows that as humans, we have different types of triggers depending on who we are and what our experiences have been in life.
Right. And I think the important thing about that is we don't even necessarily have to be quote unquote traumatized to be triggered by some of these things.
Right.
Right. As an adult, do I want to be called out in front of others? So I remember Matthew Portell, one of our favorites. We love him. He's just the bomb and wonderful and fantastic. He was a principal at a school in Nashville that employed trauma-informed policies. And I remember him sharing a joke, I'm assuming, about telling his faculty that he was going to implement a behavior chart during faculty meetings. And that when they were focused and attentive, he was going to ask them to clip up in front of their peers. But if they were having sidebar conversations or he caught them on their phone, he would tell them to clip down in front of their peers. And he was like, how do you think that went over? Right. And I think if we're not going to do it to a colleague, maybe we shouldn't be doing it to our kids. Also, super important, and we forget, it is not just that student. That student is not coming to us from a bubble. That student is a part of a family environment, and there are triggers for those families. So I'm going to leave this up for a moment, and then I'm going to ask Todd to look at him and tell me if any of those speak to him.
Yeah, like, so there's so again, it's like ones that you wouldn't think about. So so for you, for me, the idea of going into a large meeting with school staff, like, that's not intimidating. It wouldn't be triggering at all. So it wouldn't even be on my radar that somebody else would be triggered by that. Whereas it would be totally understandable how, like, if I was treated disrespectfully when I arrived at the school, how that would be triggering. And so again, it's like sometimes we might not have the empathy or the sort of the vision to sort of see what other people might be triggered by, and we need to be reflective on that.
Yeah. And especially if I think about, for some of these families, their school experiences were traumatic. So the trigger is walking through the door. They walk in the hallway and they're already in a fight, flight, or freeze stress response, right? And oftentimes we are not having meetings with a lot of school staff to talk about how awesome this kid is. We have these meetings to address deficiencies that we are concerned about. And that confusion and lack of clarity, we use so many acronyms in education, and it's our lingo. So we know what we're talking about, and these parents don't. And when any of us are in situations where we feel like we don't understand what people are talking about and no one is taking the time to explain it, I know my tendency oftentimes is to become defensive. And I don't always feel comfortable saying, I don't understand what you're talking about. I need you to explain it to me. So when we take this trauma lens, I think it is super important that we remember it's not just about the kid. It's about the system, right? Their family system, the community system. What experiences did these families have growing up with their school? Another long list. This is what trauma might look like. And the reason why I say might is because some of these just apply to some kids. Teenagers have difficulty sleeping because of all of the brain and hormonal changes that are going on, right? Some students are just more anxious. Same time, we have likely seen ourselves over the past few years become more anxious and fearful, right? And especially depending on how much news we watch or read or listen to. We may have experienced ourselves more feelings of guilt or shame as a result of what we have or have not been able to cope with. So It doesn't mean that if you see these, it is trauma, but it also means if you see these, it's not. Sometimes the most important question we can ask is, hey, what's up? Hey, what's going on? And as someone who has participated in several mandated reporting presentations, tell me more about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'm so tired, Miss Lee. I never get any sleep in my house. Well, tell me about that. Well, I got to share the bed with my little sister and my little brother, right? So at this point, I've given you all this information and you're thinking, well, what in the world am I supposed to do with this? Right? So I know about the stress response and I know about the autonomic nervous system. And I know that there are all these triggers that can happen in a classroom and in a school environment. And I don't want to trigger the parents. So what am I supposed to do with all of this information? And I feel like as educators, and I know this because I spent many years in a classroom, every year there would be some new thing. And I would say, I cannot put another thing on my plate. I cannot put another thing on my plate. There's a change in curriculum. They want you to do your unit plans differently. I want you to turn in your lesson plans every week. We're going to switch this and you're required to do this. And now you're going to add this. And it's like every year there was something new. And I just could not think of how to add anything more. And when we talk about trauma sensitive practices, it can feel like another thing that we are putting on our plate. And the point of this is that the relationships that we have with our students and our families are the plate. When we connect with our students, when we have relationships with our students, this isn't something extra. This is the foundation it's all built on. No correction without connection. If I have a relationship with my student, then I'm going to have that much more opportunity to connect and make skillful responses to their behaviors so that when something happens, those corrections are not nearly as amplified. So I look to regulate. Remember the brainstem, right? First part. So I look to regulate. What am I doing in my classroom to help my students regulate? Start with grounding exercises throughout the day. Remind your kids, let's take 3 deep breaths together. Show them what a deep breath is. I like the, I called it dandelion breathing, right? We would smell the flower and make a wish. Because when you blow out that way, it slows it down, right? There's that parasympathetic that works against the emotions. Ask kids to find something in the environment that makes them happy or helps them feel calm. Ask them to notice what types of areas in their body are tense and see if they can relax. There's a really good Go Noodle that I used to use in my classroom called On and Off. And it was like a graduated, almost like a graduated body scan where you would tense and then you would release. Because so often we are holding that tension and we don't even know. Teach this all the time. Don't start teaching it when they have lost, right? When their prefrontal cortex is offline. That's not the time, right? The regulation needs to happen all the time. That structure and consistency. Calendars, schedules, visuals. If you are an elementary school teacher, especially early childhood, you already know this. I am like preaching to a choir on this one because y'all know what happens when we have an assembly and what it does to the kids because they are off their schedule. So we stay consistent as much as possible and we prepare our kids when a change is going to happen. More movement. We need to have more movement. Even if it's just getting up because you notice the kids seem jacked up, stand up, let's do 5 jumping jacks. I would have my kids do that, like face this wall, do 5, fade this wall, do 5, fade this wall, do 5, right? And then I'd turn it into math and I'd say, okay, skip count by 5. How many jumping jacks did we just do, right? Build it in. Model the self-regulation behaviors. This is a really big part of mindfulness. And, Todd can tell you that in and of itself is like a whole nother type presentation. But I used to, when I would get really frustrated, I would stand in front of my classroom and I'd say like, oh gosh, man, I am hot. My shoulders are super tense. I don't know what's happening. Oh man, what is going on? And I am feeling so frustrated. I don't know. Why am I feeling frustrated? And it was always so funny because my kids would be like, we're really loud. Right? What do I need to do? Oh, we need to take some deep breaths, Miss Lee. Right? Name it, model it. Do check-ins. Kids come in the morning. Hey, what's your interior weather, right? What's your inner weather today? You feeling sunny? You feeling foggy? How are you doing? And providing choice, really important, especially for our kids that are in these toxic environments, because choice is what they don't have, right? Do not make a forced choice where it's like you behave or you go to the office. That's escalation. That's not choice, right? You can sit at your desk or you could sit at in your square on the carpet. I really don't have a problem with either one, but if you choose to sit in your square, I need you to not touch the people around you. If it's easier to sit at your desk and not bug others, feel free to sit at your desk, right? Mm-hmm. Then we got to have those relationships. So this is the limbic system I talked about earlier. I got to connect, reframe those challenging behaviors. So at the end of every year, I would do awards. So this is a really good way to reframe challenging behaviors, right? Because you're like, oh gosh, I got that kid. What am I going to do with that kid? What award am I going to give that kid? Right. And one of my favorite awards to give was the Future Teacher Award, which basically meant you are super bossy. And the parents always knew. Right. They always knew exactly what that meant. And the kids they loved it. Seek to respond rather than react. Right. We are the adults, for better or worse. We are the adults in the room. Right. Our nervous system is the primary intervention. If it means that I tell a student, wow, I need to take a few deep breaths, that's okay, right? You're actually modeling self-regulation. Model positive social connections. Take time to have brief conversations with your kids in the morning, right? How are you doing? Check in. Pay attention. Learn who your kids are beyond their classroom. Make sure they know that they're not just a test score. Do they have brothers and sisters? What do they like to do on the weekends? Emphasize caring connections. Include those families, right? Reach out. Newsletters, absolutely. Phone calls. I know it's annoying. I know it's time consuming, but boy, howdy. Oftentimes the first time these parents hear from us is when something goes wrong. Help them expect positive things to come out, right? Provide gratitude activities that can be done. I used to put a little mindful moment in my newsletter each week, things that you could do with your family, and communicate appreciation of the efforts. Recognize that sometimes just getting by is taking all of the effort that we have. Our rules and routines need to be really clear, consistent, safe, and inclusive. Now, safe means not just physical safety, but emotional safety. A child who is growing up in a chaotic environment is not going to trust that the environment at school is safe just because you said so. That trust is going to have to be built. Inclusive means you hold the kids accountable by including them in the rules and routines. So this is from a 4th grade classroom that I visited, and he had, at the beginning of the year, had a conversation with the kids about the things that they wanted to see in the classroom. What does respect mean? What does it sound like? What is responsibility? And the kids participated in these conversations so that they had ownership. Another classroom that I visited, the teacher had put together these routines and procedures with these little D rings. They were at every set of tables, right? They had little table groups, and there was one hanging by the door. She'd gone over it with the students at the beginning of the year. If she saw a student struggling, she would turn to that particular page and share it with the kid. There was clarity about the expectations. So often, I think we tell kids to do something, assuming that their definition of whatever that is the same as ours, and we have to take the time to operationalize these terms. We've got to have conversations about, this is what respect is, this is what kindness is, it looks like, it feels like, it sounds like this. And when we start to consider our policies and how we respond and provide consequences, we have got to start asking some different questions. 2 resources I have listed. Alex Chevron-Vanette wrote a book called Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education. It is powerful and important. And Paul Gorski, out of the Equity Literacy Institute, housed in Asheville, North Carolina, have provided some guidelines. When we think about policies, is it responsive to students that are already experiencing trauma? Is it preventing future trauma, or is it possibly contributing? How could it be changed so that it aligns with an equity-centered, trauma-informed principle? And one of the most important questions I think we can ask ourselves is, in whose image was this policy created? So I'm going to give an example, because policy questions can be really hard. There was a policy in a school district, and it makes perfect sense. Okay, kindergarten and 1st grade, there has to be an adult to meet them at the bus stop. At the end of the day, when they are dropped off, there has to be an adult there. If an adult isn't there, there has to be another older student on the bus that has been identified, right? So that that child can safely get to their home. That policy makes perfect sense. I totally understand where the policy is coming from. If there was not someone there to meet the child and no older student had been identified, the student would have to be taken back to the school, and the parent would have to come and pick them up. Okay, I think we can all understand where this policy comes from. Let's think about that kid that I had who has a single mom, and he's the oldest, and the 3 youngers are at home, and she has no support. How often do you think she was able to meet him at the bus stop?
Not much.
Right? Because how hard is it to wrangle 3 kids, 4 and under? Now, how much harder is it now for her to go and pick up her child at school? And how long is that going to take? And how long is that kid going to sit in the front office knowing that, once again, his mom wasn't there, and so he has to wait? That policy was created in the image of a family that has access to resources and support and transportation. Because what happens if that family doesn't have a car? So I do believe so many of our policies are created with the best of intentions, but we do not think about who these policies are affecting. And we do not consider the populations that we are working with. And our populations are not predominantly middle class. And that's whose image we keep creating these policies, right? That is the image. So I've given you so much information about trauma and adversity. And I want to share this video with you. Todd, have you seen this video before?
I don't know. It doesn't look familiar right now. And the thumbnail doesn't look familiar.
All right. So, but before I do this, is there anything I need to know? Are there any questions that we've had? Is there anything that I need to be included or clued in on?
I want to, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll let you show the video, and then I have some things I'd want to just mention or pick your brain about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So I love that, because I feel like oftentimes when especially if we're on the beginning stages of this journey of becoming trauma informed, it's sort of like taking your first psychology class and then you start to diagnose everybody.
Mm-hmm.
If you go into your classrooms looking for trauma, you're totally going to find it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would have said that before COVID, but I'm really saying it now.
Oh, yeah.
But if that's the only thing you look for, it's going to be the only thing you find.
Mm.
And that is only one piece of anybody's puzzle. The adversity that we've experienced is just one small piece of the puzzle. And there's so much more to all of us than whatever bad thing has happened. So don't forget to look at the whole kid.
Right.
Right. And don't just ask what's wrong with you or even what happened to you, but reframe it to what is strong with you. Right. So I just love that.
Mm.
So ask me some questions. What you got?
All right. So I want people to make the connection to why this is so important. And have you watched, there's a show on, I think it's Apple TV, Ted Lasso. Have you watched that yet?
I have not, because I don't have Apple TV.
Okay. Well, if you get a trial subscription, it's worth checking out. So he has this quote by Walt Whitman that he talks a lot about, and it's be curious, not judgmental. Mm-hmm. And every time I read more, and you and I are reading What Happened by Dr. Bruce Perry and leading some conversations on that. Oprah Winfrey was a co-author on that. Every time I read more and I hear from you and I keep thinking about this, I go back to that quote, because I think if we think about how do we want to transform education through this work, if we can reduce it down to its simplest terms, I really think that phrase, be curious, not judgmental, helps me remember like why we're doing this, because it's we've had a tendency in education to label students and to label behavior. This is the good kid, this is the bad kid, this is the troublemaker. And it's that judgment part of our brain, which is a natural, normal part of our brains. We make judgments, but sometimes we're quick to judge and label a child. Mm-hmm. instead of being curious about what it really is going on, because there's this we see this maladaptive behavior, we take it very personally, and understandably so. It's hard not to, and we're getting frustrated and agitated because there's things we want to do, and the students preventing us from doing those things, and we're getting escalated, and then we're not really thinking about the causes and conditions that led up to that maladaptive behavior. We just want it to go away. So we feel like we just punish it. We just, scold and punish. And I think that's kind of where like this light bulb went on for me with this work, this trauma work, is let's get out of the labeling and judging of kids, and let's dig into what's really going on and be curious about what's happening in this child's life and what led up to this behavior, which is an easy thing to say, hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
So I would say part of it, I think part of it is cultural in the sense that we like to label everything. Also, unfortunately, in education, if we don't label things, they don't get help. So that is one unfortunate part that happens, right? If we label a student with ADHD, or if we label a student as learning disabled, or if we label a student as, oppositionally defiant, then we might have access to resources that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. So that's one of the catch-22s. I remember hearing somebody talk about, the idea of an onion, right? People are like onions and you peel the layers. So I heard that one time, and then I heard somebody else say, you know what, that's not really what we are. We're not an onion where you peel away our layers. We're more like a bulb of garlic with a lot of different cloves inside. I really love that image, right?
Yeah.
And so what's important for me with that image is I would think about, okay, so yeah, I've got this kid in my classroom who does bad stuff, right? Makes poor decisions, but it doesn't mean he's a bad kid.
Right.
So what skills is this student lacking to help them be more successful in my classroom? Right. And also trying to help, I would talk about, and this came from some work that I had done with the drama teacher years ago, but he would always talk about strong and weak choices. And I thought that was brilliant. It wasn't about bad or good. And he said, and the thing about that is that weak can always be made stronger. Right. So there's always opportunity for growth. So I would talk to my kids a lot about, that was a weak choice. What can we do to make a stronger one next time?
Yeah, I like that.
Right.
I also heard two people use skillful and unskillful.
Yeah, I do love skillful and unskillful.
Yeah. Like that's like a much less judgmental way of framing a behavior. That was a skillful way to manage that. That was unskillful. It doesn't you don't absorb it as, well, I'm bad. Like, why are you being so bad? And it's just the way, like, a lot of us grew up with that framework. And so all of this is really kind of like an unlearning.
Yes.
It's an unlearning of really some relic ideas that we grew up with from parents and authority figures and culture. Yeah. And so it's so much of this work is undoing those sort of habits and thought patterns that we have around human behavior.
Well, I've had kids in the past that would never turn in their homework, for example. And there was a part of me that felt like, what? Part of homework is like learning responsibility. And I totally, right. So that's my positive frame. Like doing homework is, and also, let's be honest, we're 6. It shouldn't take you 6 minutes. Come on, friends. Like, you can get that done. However, if I also know that this family has a lot of activities in the afternoon, or maybe it's a single parent and they just do not have the energy to have that struggle with their kid, I can say, you know what? It's really not that important, right? Yeah. Like, I can change that policy based on that family's experiences, knowing that that is not the hill to die on. And I know, like, in the situation where I talk about with my student whose mom was single and there were so many kids, you know, I contacted our school social worker because I wasn't concerned about the children's safety, right? I wasn't going to make some sort of call to DSS. I was concerned about the mom's mental health, and I wanted to make sure that she was like, what can we do to help her? Right? Because this school is a community, and I am I'm a resource, hopefully, for her. And, you know, the social worker did get a chance to go out and speak with her. And she said, you know, mom was very resistant at first, as I'm sure she would be, right? Like, some social worker shows up, she's like, no, I'm not DSS, right? Like, I'm from the school, and I want to know, what can I do to help you so that you don't have to carry this burden by yourself? Because that kid came to school every day bathed, and he had breakfast, you know, and I'm like, listen, I could be my age and have 4 kids under the age of 6, and I don't know that you'd be bathed and have breakfast, right? Like, So I think that's part of it too, is taking out instead of asking, you know, like you said, like, what's wrong with you? Like, what can I do to make this easier on you? How can I help you? What resources can I provide you with?
Right. And folks need to understand that, not interpret that as having a poverty of expectations or not holding kids to account or anything, or coddling kids. And that's one of the big misconceptions around this work, is that, oh, well, you're just trying to coddle kids and give them excuses and enabling bad behavior or something like that. And you have to, again, it's all sort of thought patterns that we have to delete and help update. We're past our time. I want to honor that. I want to thank you again. Thank you for your part in the retreat. Thank you for this tonight. And I know we're looking forward to maybe doing some in-person stuff when we move into our new headquarters. But Kara, thank you so much for everything that you do to promote just good things. And I said I wouldn't be judgmental, but I'm going to be judged. You promote good things. You promote adaptive behaviors. How about that? Skillful, strong choices. So thank you so much for doing that. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, a school or district wants to reach out to you about doing some training, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Email. So they can just email me at Kara Lee, that KARALEE 99 at bellsouth.net.
Okay. I'll put that in the comments for anybody who's watching later on. But thank you again, Kara, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon. I want to remind everybody who's watching tonight, you can find the entire webinar on the COOL website. That's the Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. It's cool.us, cewl.us. And I want to just invite everybody to consider joining our movement at the SCEA, and you can do that at jointhescea.org. So many reasons to be a part of our movement. There's a ton of benefits. You're not only joining the SCEA, but you're joining the National Education Association, the largest labor union in the United States, with over 3 million teachers from across the country. And we would just love to have you in the movement, and tons of great benefits. But more importantly than that transactional kind of piece is just having a collective voice so that we can speak up together to create the kind of change that we need to bring this kind of stuff that we're talked about tonight into more classrooms, into more schools, to have a positive impact on school culture. And finally, I just want to, again, congratulate Lisa Ellis. And we're just so happy to be endorsing her for Superintendent of Education. And if you'd like to learn more about her campaign, you can go to lisaforsc.com. That's lisaforsc.com. Kara, any final words before we sign off?
I'm good. I hope that every educator out there has a better year. That's what I'm going to say. So I'm thinking of you.
Yes, and if there's any way we can support you, don't hesitate to reach out. Carrie, you have a good night. Everybody else, we will be back on Tuesday. Dr. Marquita Blades is going to be with us August 2nd. That's next Tuesday. She's going to do a session on self-care, and hopefully we'll see you then. All right, take care.